December 7th, 1941. 7:48 a.m., Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida led 183 Japanese aircraft over Oahu in what would become the most devastating surprise attack in American history. Every pilot in that first wave had logged over 800 flight hours. They were the finest naval aviators in the world, products of Japan's brutal, selective training system that had been perfecting combat pilots since 1932. 4 years later, on August 15, 1945, the Japanese Air Force was flown by teenagers with 40 hours of training, crashing planes filled with explosives into American ships because they hadn't been taught how to land. Before we continue with the story of how this catastrophic reversal happened, we need your help to keep these forgotten chapters of history alive. If you're already hooked by what you're hearing, hit that like button right now. It tells YouTube to share this with more people who care about real history. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss another story of innovation and strategy from World War II. And here's something we love. Drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Your country, your city. We have viewers from Buenos Aires to Berlin, from Manila to Montreal. Are you a veteran? Did your grandfather serve in the Pacific? Did someone in your family work in aircraft production? We want to hear from you. Now, back to 1941, where two nations were about to wage a war that would be decided not by courage or tactics, but by something far more mundane: education. The disparity didn't begin with Pearl Harbor. It began in 1903, when the Wright brothers flew at Kitty Hawk, and America fell in love with aviation. By 1941, the United States had 125 licensed civilian pilots. Japan had 400. This wasn't an accident. This was infrastructure. This was culture. This was 38 years of Americans tinkering with engines in their garages, driving millions of automobiles, reading repair manuals, and understanding how machines worked. In 1940, there were 27 million registered vehicles in the United States. In Japan, there were 47,000. Lieutenant Robert Morgan grew up in Asheville, North Carolina. His father owned a Chevrolet dealership. By age 14, Morgan could disassemble and rebuild a carburetor blindfolded. By 16, he was rebuilding Model T engines for pocket money. By 18, he'd saved enough to pay for flying lessons at a local airfield, $35 for 10 hours with an instructor. This was normal in America. In Japan, aviation was the exclusive domain of the military and the wealthy elite. Flying was mysterious, technical, reserved for the chosen few. The average Japanese citizen had never seen an airplane up close, let alone touched one. When Morgan enlisted in the Army Air Corps in January 1940, he already had 87 hours of flight time. The military didn't have to teach him how to fly. They just had to teach him how to fly in combat. When Petty Officer Kiyoshi Ogawa joined the Imperial Japanese Navy in 1938, he had never seen an airplane except in photographs. He came from a farming village in Gunma Prefecture. His father grew rice. His uncle repaired bicycles. The first time Ogawa touched an aircraft control stick, he was 19 years old, and his instructor slapped him across the face for making a mistake on the ground. These two men, Morgan and Ogawa, would never meet, but their training would determine who won the Pacific War. In early 1939, the U.S. Army Air Corps had 26 Iwasan personnel and 400 aircraft. Chief of Staff General George Marshall looked at the numbers and saw a problem that terrified him more than any enemy. If war came, America had no way to train pilots fast enough. Marshall assigned the problem to General Henry Hap Arnold, who had learned to fly from the Wright brothers themselves in 1911. Arnold understood something fundamental. You couldn't just train pilots, you had to train instructors. And to train instructors, you needed infrastructure that didn't exist. Arnold's solution was industrial, methodical, and staggering in scale. On June 27, 1939, Congress authorized the Civilian Pilot Training Program. The goal trained 20,000 civilian pilots per year, using colleges and universities as training centers. Students would receive ground school instruction in classrooms and flight training at local airfields. The government would pay the entire cost. By December 1941, the program had trained 435 civilian pilots. These weren't combat pilots yet, but they understood basic aerodynamics, navigation, and aircraft systems. They'd logged 35-50 flight hours. They could take off, fly a pattern, and land without killing themselves. This was the base, the foundation, the starting point that Japan couldn't replicate. Because Japan didn't have 435,000 young men who could read technical manuals, calculate fuel consumption, or navigate using sectional charts. In 1940, Japan's literacy rate was 85%. America's was 97%. That 12% gap, 5 million people, meant 5 million potential pilots, mechanics, navigators and bombardiers that Japan simply couldn't field. But literacy was just the beginning. Lieutenant James Sweat grew up in Seattle, Washington. He was 20 years old when he entered Navy flight training in January 1942. Before he ever touched a real aircraft, Sweat spent 40 hours in a Link trainer, a mechanical flight simulator invented by Edwin Link in 1929. The Link trainer was a miracle. A fully enclosed cockpit mounted on a pneumatic motion platform, it could simulate banks, climbs, dives and spins. It had working instruments, altimeter, airspeed indicator, turn coordinator, compass. An instructor sat outside with a plotting board, tracking the student's simulated flight path, watching for mistakes, correcting errors in real time. The Link trainer cost $3,500 in 1942. The US military bought 10,000 of them. Japan bought 12. Why? Because the Japanese military believed in spiritual training. They believed that courage, discipline and warrior spirit mattered more than mechanical repetition. They believed that a true pilot learned by flying real aircraft, making real mistakes, surviving real consequences. This philosophy produced extraordinary pilots, the ones who survived. Commander Minoru Genda, who planned the Pearl Harbor attack, had logged 300 flight hours by 1941. Lieutenant Saburo Sakai, Japan's third highest scoring ace, spent 2 years in basic training, flying obsolete biplanes until he could perform aerobatic maneuvers blind. But this system was slow, brutal, wasteful. Of 500 candidates who entered Japanese naval flight training in 1937, only 100 graduated. The rest washed out, crashed or died during training. America couldn't afford a 93% attrition rate, so they cheated. They used simulators to teach basic skills, reserving real aircraft for advanced maneuvers. They standardized training so every pilot learned the same procedures in the same sequence. They created training commands, separate organizations whose only job was to produce pilots, not fight wars. By March 1942, the U.S. Army Air Forces had established the Flying Training Command, with headquarters at Fort Worth, Texas. Major General Barton Yunt commanded 55,000 aircraft, 10,000 instructors, and 487 airfields scattered across the American South and Southwest, regions chosen for good weather, flat terrain, and vast empty spaces, where student pilots could crash without killing civilians. The system was industrial. Mechanical efficient. Primary training, 9 weeks, 65 flight hours in Stearman, PT-17 biplanes. Basic training, 9 weeks, 70 flight hours in Vultee BT-13 monoplanes. Advanced training, 9 weeks, 75 flight hours in North American AT-6 Texans. Total, 27 weeks, 210 flight hours before a pilot ever saw a combat aircraft. Japan couldn't match this. They didn't have the instructors, the aircraft, or the infrastructure. But more critically, they didn't have the fuel. In 1941, the United States produced 14 billion barrels of oil. Japan produced 8 million. This wasn't a minor disadvantage. This was existential. Every hour, an American student pilot spent in a trainer consumed 25 gallons of aviation gasoline. Multiply that by 210 hours of training, and each pilot required 250 gallons before entering combat. Multiply that by 193, 440 pilots trained in 1943 alone, and you get 1.01 billion gallons just for training. Japan couldn't afford this. By 1943, after losing control of the Netherlands' East Indies oil fields, Japan was rationing aviation fuel for combat operations. There was no fuel for training flights, so they stopped training. Flight Petty Officer Yasuo Kuwahara entered training in March 1944 at Hiro Naval Air Base. He was 16 years old. He'd never driven a car, never operated machinery more complex than a rice thresher. His father was a fisherman in Kyushu. Kuwahara's training schedule: Week 1-4. Classroom instruction, calisthenics, bayonet drills. Week 5-8. Minimal flight time in trainers, 12 hours total. Week 9. Solo flight in operational aircraft. Week 10. Graduation total flight hours 60. Kuwahara was assigned to the 72nd Shinbu Squadron, a kamikaze unit, on October 11, 1944. He was ordered to crash his aircraft into American ships off Okinawa. He survived only because his engine failed during takeoff, and his commanders didn't have a replacement aircraft. Kuwahara later wrote, "I didn't know how to fight. I only knew how to die." This was the mathematical reality of the Pacific War by 1944. Japan was sending children with 60 hours of training against American pilots with 400 hours and link trainer simulation, gunnery practice, formation flying, instrument navigation and combat tactics. It was slaughter. The numbers were obscene. Between January 1942 and August 1945, the United States trained 193, 440 pilots, Army Air Forces, 61, 850 pilots, U.S. Navy, 10, 180 pilots, U.S. Marine Corps. Total 265, 470 combat pilots in 44 months. Japan trained 15 Zero-Zoran pilots in the same period, but the disparity wasn't just quantity, it was quality. Lieutenant Alexander Vratsiu graduated from flight training in August 1942 with 325 hours. He joined Fighting Squadron 6 aboard USS Intrepid in January 1943. Before his first combat mission, he flew 80 additional hours, carrier landing practice, gunnery training, formation tactics. On June 19, 1944, during the Battle of the Philippine Sea, Vratsiu shot down 6 Japanese aircraft in 8 minutes. He didn't just win this fight, he won easily. The Japanese pilots he killed that day had an average of 90 flight hours. Vratsiu had 580. This wasn't courage versus cowardice. This was professional versus amateur. Vratsiu could judge deflection angles instinctively, manage his energy state without thinking, clear his tail while tracking a target. The Japanese pilots he fought were brave, determined, and completely outmatched. "It was like shooting ducks," Vratsiu said afterward. He didn't say this with pride. He said it with sadness. The most devastating moment for Japanese aviation didn't happen in combat. It happened in a classroom. In November 1944, Admiral Takijiro Onishi visited the Mabalacat Naval Air Base in the Philippines. He gathered the remaining pilots, most of them 18 to 21 years old, with less than 100 hours of training, and explained the new strategy. "Japan no longer has the resources to train pilots who can defeat the Americans in combat," Onishi said. "Therefore, you will become kamikaze. You will load your aircraft with explosives and crash into enemy ships. One plane, one ship. This is the only way we can win." Lieutenant Yukio Seki, 23 years old, was chosen to lead the first kamikaze attack on October 25, 1944. Seki had 180 hours of flight training, more than most pilots by that point. Before climbing into his Zero fighter, he told a reporter, "Japan's future looks bleak if it is forced to kill its best youth in suicide attacks. I'm not going for the emperor or the empire. I'm going because I was ordered to." Seki crashed into the escort carrier USS St. Lo. The ship sank in 30 minutes. Japan called this special attack. America called it desperation. Between October 1944 and August 1945, Japan launched 3 862 kamikaze sorties. They sank 47 Allied ships and damaged 300 more. But they lost 3 862 aircraft and pilots, irreplaceable resources that could never be recovered. In the same period, the United States graduated 87 Zero new pilots. The American training system wasn't perfect. It was bureaucratic, sometimes inefficient, occasionally deadly. Between 1942 and 1945, 530 American pilots died in training accidents. That's more than the entire Japanese Naval Air Force. But here's the difference. America could afford 530 training deaths and still field the largest air force in history. Japan couldn't afford 500. Lieutenant Richard Bong graduated from flight training in January 1942 with 275 hours. He arrived in the Pacific Theater in September 1942 and flew 200 combat missions, shooting down 40 Japanese aircraft, the highest American ace total of the war. Bong survived every mission. He returned to the United States in January 1945 to become a test pilot. He died on August 6, 1945, when a Lockheed P-80 jet fighter malfunctioned during takeoff at Burbank, California. He was 24 years old. The Japanese pilot, who might have fought Bong if he'd survived long enough, never got the chance. He was killed during training in 1943, when his instructor ordered him to practice low-altitude aerobatics in bad weather. His name is unknown. There were no records kept. The most comprehensive data on the training disparity came from interrogations of captured Japanese pilots in 1945. U.S. intelligence officers interviewed 127 surviving pilots. The results were compiled in a classified report titled Japanese Pilot Training, Assessment of Capability. Average flight hours before first combat mission, 1941, 800 hours, 1942, 500 hours, 1943, 275 hours, 1944, 120 hours, 1945, 45 hours. One captured pilot, Ensign Toshio Hashimoto, told interrogators, "We practiced takeoffs for 1 week, then we practiced flying straight for 1 week. Then we practiced finding ships. Nobody taught us how to land. They said it didn't matter." Hashimoto was 17 years old. He was shot down on his second mission by a pilot from USS Essex, Lieutenant Doug Baker, 22 years old, 415 flight hours, who later described the fight as unsportsmanlike. The bureaucratic failure in Japan wasn't incompetence, it was systemic. The Japanese military was organized around elite warriors leading peasant soldiers. This worked in ground combat, where individual courage could compensate for inferior equipment. But aviation was different. Aviation required technical knowledge, mechanical aptitude, and standardized procedures, things that couldn't be taught through willpower. The Americans understood this. They created training manuals that were hundreds of pages long, with step-by-step procedures, emergency checklists, and standardized terminology. They filmed training movies showing proper techniques. They built specialized schools, navigation school, gunnery school, instrument flying school. Japan had none of this. Japanese pilots learned by watching senior pilots and imitating them. There were no written procedures. Each instructor taught differently. Some techniques were effective, others were deadly. There was no way to know until it was too late. Ensign Saburo Sakai, one of Japan's greatest aces, described his training. "My instructor hit me every day, sometimes with his fist, sometimes with a bamboo stick. He said pain would teach me to avoid mistakes." He was right. I learned quickly. But many students died before they learned. This system worked when Japan had time and resources. By 1944, they had neither. The final insult came after the war ended. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender. Across the Pacific, thousands of Japanese pilots sat in cockpits, waiting for orders that would never come. At Atsugi Naval Air Base near Tokyo, 23 pilots gathered in a hangar. They'd been trained as kamikaze. They had 80 hours of flight time each. They'd been told they would die for Japan. Now Japan was surrendering, and they didn't know what to do. One pilot, 19-year-old Hajime Fuji, had never seen combat. He'd completed training in July 1945 and was awaiting assignment to a special attack unit when the war ended. Fuji later described his feelings: relief, shame, confusion. I'd been prepared to die. Now I had to figure out how to live. Fuji returned to his village in Hokkaido. He worked as a farmer, married, had 3 children. He never told anyone he'd been a pilot until 1982, when a historian tracked him down. "I wasn't a pilot," Fuji said. "I was a boy in an airplane." Meanwhile, in America, 265, 470 combat pilots returned home. Most of them went to college on the GI Bill, using their technical training to become engineers, mechanics, and businessmen. Robert Morgan, the mechanic's son from North Carolina, flew 25 combat missions as pilot of the B-17 bomber Memphis Belle. After the war, he returned to Asheville and opened an aircraft parts business. He died in 2004 at age 85, still flying his own Cessna. Alexander Vretziu, who shot down 6 planes in 8 minutes, became a test pilot and later worked for Wells Fargo Bank. He died in 2015 at age 96. Doug Baker, who shot down Toshio Hashimoto in what he called an unsportsmanlike fight, became a commercial airline pilot for United Airlines. He flew 747s on trans-Pacific routes until mandatory retirement in 1985. He died in 2019 at age 97. None of them considered themselves heroes. They'd done their jobs, they'd survived, that was enough. In 1982, a Japanese historian named Masatake Okumiya published a book titled Zero: The Story of Japan's Air War in the Pacific. In it, he included a statistical analysis that had been classified for 37 years. Okumiya calculated that if Japan had matched America's training standards, 400 hours per pilot, standardized procedures, adequate fuel for training, they would have needed 6 billion gallons of aviation fuel. They had 800 million. 45 Isundred training aircraft. They had 500. 18 Isundred qualified instructors. They had 200. 4 years of peacetime preparation. They had declared war. The Pacific War was lost before Pearl Harbor, Okumiya wrote. Not because of strategy or tactics, but because Japan attempted industrial warfare without an industrial base. We built beautiful aircraft. We trained brave pilots, but we couldn't train enough of them, and bravery can't compensate for experience. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, who planned Pearl Harbor, understood this before the war began. In a meeting with Prime Minister Fumimaro Konoe in September 1941, Yamamoto said, "I can run wild for 6 months. After that, I have no expectations." He was wrong. Japan ran wild for 10 months, until the Battle of Midway in June 1942, when they lost 4 fleet carriers and 248 experienced pilots who couldn't be replaced. After Midway, the mathematics became inevitable. America graduated 9,000 pilots per month. Japan graduated 400. Every month the gap widened. By August 1945, the United States had more active pilots than Japan had trained in the entire war. The most forgotten part of this story isn't the famous aces or the dramatic battles, it's the instructors, men like Captain Thomas Jackson, who taught primary flight training at Bainbridge Army Airfield in Georgia. Jackson was 34 years old in 1942, too old for combat duty. He'd been a civilian flight instructor before the war, teaching rich college students how to fly Piper Cubs on weekends. Between January 1942 and August 1945, Jackson personally trained 487 student pilots. He flew 6 200 hours, more than most combat pilots. He survived 4 crashes when students panicked and froze on the controls. He died in 1963 of a heart attack, never having received any military decoration. His obituary in the Bainbridge Post-Searchlight was 4 sentences long. It mentioned that he'd been a flight instructor during the war. It didn't mention the 487 pilots he'd trained or the unknown number of lives those pilots saved. There's no memorial to Thomas Jackson, no museum exhibit, no Wikipedia page. But somewhere in a dusty filing cabinet at Maxwell Air Force Base in Alabama, there's a training log with his signature on 487 completion certificates. Each one represents a pilot who survived the war because Jackson taught him how to recover from a stall, how to judge a crosswind landing, how to stay calm when the engine failed. Japan had 200 instructors. America had 10,000 Thomas Jacksons. That's why America trained 500,000 pilots, and Japan struggled to train 500. If this story changed how you think about what really decides wars, not courage but infrastructure, not bravery but education, hit that like button. These forgotten stories of logistics, planning, and ordinary people doing extraordinary work need to be shared. Subscribe to this channel for more deep dives into the hidden machinery of World War II, the stories that textbooks skip because they're not dramatic enough, even though they decided everything. And comment below. Did someone in your family work in wartime training or production? What did they do? Drop your story below, we want to hear it. Thank you for keeping these memories alive. See you in the next one.